Okay, so the reason I wanted to start with all this stuff about, the record amount of Americans that are voluntarily leaving their job, about maybe a disconnect between the way the world functions and the amount of people who can actually speak the language of money, is because you put out a video in 2010, I believe, that ended up going viral. I think it was just called "I Am the 1%, Let's Talk." And you went down to a bunch of Occupy Wall Street movements and started having conversations, right? With everybody there. It was like, let's talk about what's going on here. Let me answer some questions for you, right? If you haven't seen this video, by the way, you should watch it because it's great. But this is 11 years ago at this point, Peter. So you went right to the heart of the protest movements during the Occupy Wall Street with a sign that said, "I am the 1%, because they were protesting the 1% at that time, and said, "Let's talk," and then had a ton of conversations. What's changed from then to now, Peter, when you look at those similar protests and how they've evolved?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't know that I can even do something like that today, because at least in that conversation, I didn't really feel threatened at all, physically, by the mob that was, around me. Whereas today, I think the whole thing would be a lot more charged. I mean, there could be a lot of violence, and they could try to make something racial out of it, because I happen to be a white man. I mean, it wasn't that big a sin back then being a white man. But today, I'm the personification of evil, right? I'm systemically racist. So, it may have been a difficult conversation to have today, in similar circumstances. But one thing that has, I think, happened is that the animosity that a lot of people feel towards capitalism has probably grown over the decade. A lot more people now probably hold capitalism in very low regard and have a very high opinion of socialism. And, my point of going down there was to point out that the problems that everybody was protesting emanated from government and central banking, not capitalism. And that it wasn't capitalism that needed to be protested. It was the government interference in capitalism. And that they needed to focus their protests in Washington and not in New York. And to the extent that the banks had gotten in bed with the government, the problem isn't the banks, it's the government. Obviously the government is, enticing these companies to get into bed with them. And so what you want to do is make it so the government can't do that. The government doesn't have this to offer, because you can't blame private actors for taking advantage of what the government offers. And in fact, in many cases, you're pressured, because if you don't take advantage of it, your competitors will, and then you'll be at a disadvantage. So what we have to do is stop the government from being able to offer this kind of help and these kind of distortions and subsidies. So, for example, the Occupy Wall Street people were mad about the Wall Street bailouts. Well, yes, so was I. But it wasn't that the companies accepted the bailouts. It was that the governments offered the bailouts in the first place.
Right.
So it's the government where our anger needs to be focused. Because a lot of the companies were like, well, if I don't take the bailout money and my competitors do, well, I mean, I'm standing on principle. For what reason? I'm going to be at a disadvantage. And so, hey, if everybody's going to get it, well, then I'm going to get mine. And so it's the government that is corrupting the whole process, not the private actors.
Right, which kind of gets us back to, the importance of teaching the language of money at an early stage. Because if you wake up in your 30s and, like I said, you look at the board and you're like, what happened here? How did I end up so behind? You feel disenfranchised. The next step is to point the finger and look for the enemy, right? And
it's like during the COVID lockdowns, I was, pointing out that a lot of people were just taking the government money and not going back to work because, the government money was more lucrative. I mean, even if you had a job, why go back to it if you're actually getting paid more not to work than you were working? I mean, why take a pay cut to go get a job? I mean, you're supposed to earn more by having a job, not earn less. I mean, most Americans or anybody, there's a value placed on leisure. People prefer leisure to work. And in fact, even if the government gives me 80% of my income on unemployment, most people would take that rather than 100% on a job. And so I talked about this, and a lot of people were saying, "Oh, Peter, you're just accusing all these Americans of being lazy." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm just recognizing that they're not foolish, and they're just making the best choice for themselves, given the various alternatives." I never blamed Americans for taking government checks and not going to work, right? That's a rational decision.
Yeah.
Especially if you're going to be one of the few Americans that says, "You know what? I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to turn down all this money and I'm going to go back to my lousy job," right? Meanwhile, all your buddies are hanging out on the beach, and you're the one fool that returned to work, right? And they've got more money than you because they're getting bigger unemployment checks than your paycheck. It's very difficult to get on that moral high ground when, you look like such an idiot, right, for occupying that space. So I don't blame people for doing this. I mean, I remember one time when I was on unemployment a long time ago, the one time of my life I collected unemployment, I made sure that I exhausted every dime of my benefits before I actually looked for a job. I mean, I was taking advantage of my paid vacation. But from an economic perspective, I'm completely against unemployment for the precise reason that people exploit it. And I'm an example of somebody who exploited a program that philosophically I was opposed to. And if I could have voted to eliminate unemployment for everybody, including myself, I would have. But once the government made it available, well, I was going to take my share, even though I didn't believe anybody should have, that opportunity. So while I was talking about all these Americans that were just taking government checks instead of going back to work, I never blamed the people. I blamed the government. It was a stupid, misguided program that actually started under Trump, right? Trump signed that idiotic bill that gave people such a huge pay increase to leave their work, leave their jobs, right? It was the government that was dumb enough to give people this choice in the first place. It wasn't the people that did the smart thing, because that's human nature. But government will never understand human nature, and they don't understand moral hazard because their policies, their subsidies, and their taxes are largely responsible for a lot of the bad things that happen.